which they get, which make it clear they've got leave to remain, they're permitted to work in the UK, also say they have no recourse to public funds. They're not allowed to claim any benefits at all. Yep. That clearly, in the current circumstances, puts them in an extraordinarily difficult position. They're not allowed to claim ESA or universal credit at all. And for them, if they're in a position where they should self-isolate in accordance with the government's guidance, they will find if they do, they suddenly have absolutely no income at all. There's a similar, related issue, I think, about the habitual residence test, which is often applied to perfectly properly to make sure that people are habitually resident in the UK and therefore are entitled to benefits. But I wonder if in the current circumstance as well, there is a case for suspending that, at least in some circumstances, because what we want is those who are working to be able to self-isolate when it's important that they do so. If they don't have access to public funds for one of these two reasons, then they will find it practically impossible to do so. And I do hope that the ministers will look at that along with their colleagues, no doubt, in the Home Office. The Citizens' Advice has argued that there should be a temporary repayment pause for claimants, and I think that's a strong point to make in the current crisis as well. People who are having to repay their universal credit advances, or perhaps paying past tax credit overpayments back through their universal credit at the moment. I think there is a case for those to be suspended. The Minister, in his opening speech, made the point, and I quote, that everybody will be supported to do the right thing. I think he's absolutely right to underline the importance of that. But for those who don't have recourse to public funds, those who don't meet the requirements of the habitual residence test, as things stand at the moment, they will not be supported to do the right thing. I think it's very important that they should be. In the budget, the Chancellor said that he was temporarily removing the minimum income floor in universal credit. When we came to read the budget documents, the position was, and as the Minister set out a few minutes ago, that this removal only applies to those directly affected by COVID-19 or by self-isolation, according to government advice. I must say, I think the government should stick with what the Chancellor of the Exchequer actually said, which is that the minimum income floor is going to be suspended altogether, because there will be quite a lot of self-employed people, and my honourable friend gave us an example earlier on in the debate, who see a big fall in their income because of what's happening in the wider economy, not because they are themselves directly affected as yet by COVID-19. And universal credit does give the opportunity for an increase in support to be provided when their income from self-employment falls. And that could work very well, I think, if the minimum income floor was suspended altogether, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer appeared to indicate was going to be the case in his budget speech last week. So I do hope that that will be looked at again, and that the caveats that have been added to that commitment since might be taken away, and that the minimum income floor will be suspended altogether for the duration of this crisis for self-employed people. I also, Madam Deputy Speaker, want to echo the point that was made a few moments ago by the honourable member who speaks for the Scottish National Party about the tax credit disregard. As things stand at the moment, if your income falls by less than £2,500, your tax credits don't increase at all. There is, in the tax credit system, a mechanism that can be used to provide people with help when their income falls. In order to get the full benefit of that, we will need to remove that £2,500 disregard. I appreciate that's a matter for the Treasury rather than for the Department for Work and Pensions, but I hope it will be done. Statutory sick pay is a big focus for this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me just make this point, that the government did consult last summer on extending statutory sick pay to those who are lower paid, those who are earning below the current threshold. But the government hasn't yet responded to that consultation. It was a consultation that was carried out several months ago. Surely, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is now the time to act. It was proposed then that statutory sick pay should be paid to people earning less than the lower earnings limit at 80% of their wage. That, I think, was the government's proposal that it consulted on. This is surely time to fast-track that proposal, to bring that proposal forward and put it into place. I appreciate it's going to need legislation to do it, but it seems to me it's very important that it is done, and I would hope that it could be picked up in the legislation that's going to be published tomorrow. Give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. On this point about statutory sick pay, two additional points there that I think the government really does need to act on. One is that this should be done in advance, up front, rather than having to have businesses reclaiming, which is putting massive pressure on them. And the other is for the self-employed. It's vital that the self-employed, because businesses in my Aberavon constituency are really under the cosh, and they need both of these measures to be included in the rethink on statutory sick pay.
Well, I think my honourable friend makes a very important couple of points, and I very much agree with him on the first point. On the second point, my understanding is that self-employed people in this position can apply for this new ESA if they meet the contribution conditions, which of course some won't, and that's where I think universal credit needs to be changed. But I think one of those routes is likely to be a solution for them rather than statutory sick pay, because that does depend on there being an employer in place. A final point I want to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, is about the argument that's been made by many, and I'm sure it's going to be made again in this debate, that the overall level of benefit should be higher, at least for the duration of this crisis, than it has been up until now. And I just want to make one argument in favour of that proposition. We've always say, and we've said on both sides of this House, that work is the best route out of poverty, and the system is designed to encourage people to seek and to find work. But at the moment, there are lots of people, and it's going to be a growing number over the coming weeks, who actually we do not want to work. We don't want to force people into jobs. In some cases, I mean, of course, for many, the position will continue to be the same in the next few weeks that it has been in the past. But there's this large and very important group who we really do not want to be working. We want them to be at home. And I think that particularly does make a case for ministers looking temporarily at raising the levels of benefits, statutory sick pay and universal credit and the others, given the current situation. A final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome what the Minister said earlier about suspension of face-to-face assessments for disability benefits. But I think what he suggested was that in practice his department will not be conducting reassessments for disability benefits either. I think if that is the practical reality, it would be very helpful if the Minister could explicitly state that. I think that would be very reassuring to a lot of people who are in receipt of disability benefits at the moment, would expect to have to be reassessed in the next few months. It's always quite an anxious time for people who are in that position. If the reality is they're not going to be reassessed for several months because everybody's so busy with everything else, I think it would be very helpful for that to be made explicit so that that reassurance can be provided. Of course, if it does turn out there are ways of doing the new assessments that don't require face-to-face meetings in the future, and if this actually works well for those new applications, then hopefully will be lessons that can be learnt for the system in the longer term. But if it is possible to make it clear that there will not be any disability benefit reassessments in the immediate next few months, I think that will be very widely welcomed.
Order, it may be helpful for members in the chamber to know that Mr. Speaker has received a message that we're expecting a statement at 5 p.m. to be delivered by the Secretary of State for Education. Rachel Reeves.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to follow my right honourable friend, the member for East Ham, who made a very powerful speech, and particularly the points he made around refugees and asylum seekers whose plight and specific issues facing them has not been discussed nearly enough, I don't think, over the last few days and weeks. Madam Deputy Speaker, at times of national, and in this case global crisis, only governments have the resources to protect our society, to protect our health, to protect the most vulnerable, to protect businesses and production, and to protect workers. Markets cannot do this. Only government can, and that is why government can and must step up to ensure that we do protect all of our citizens, to direct our national economy and to help and support those people who most need it, and to ensure resources get to where they most need. I'm going to primarily talk this afternoon about statutory sick pay and issues around that. But can I just also say that when newspapers report today that some Harley Street clinics are offering tests for coronavirus for £395 so that you can get this test if you have the money, but you can't get this test if you work in a GP surgery, that is utterly unacceptable. And the role of government is to intervene to ensure that the resources go to where they are most needed. And that is not to the rich and to the powerful. It is those people who are delivering our frontline services and need protection. And I urge government ministers to do that. The measures taken by the Chancellor yesterday were necessary and they were worthwhile to protect our economic infrastructure, to support particularly sectors of our economy that have been most severely hit, to support businesses who are not responsible for the collapse of demand that they are now seeing. But the same is also true for workers. They are not responsible for the predicament that they now find themselves in, and yet support for them was missing in the statement from the Chancellor yesterday. And the Minister has said today that everybody will be supported to do the right thing, and the Prime Minister has said that as well. And we all want that, Madam Deputy Speaker. But I'm afraid at the moment it is not the case. People are not being supported to do the right thing, because the right thing for many, many people now is not to go to work, not to spread this virus, but to stay at home. But if we really want people to do the right thing, we need to support them to make that decision. And so I'll now come, Madam Deputy Speaker, to talk about statutory sick pay. It has been well rehearsed in the debate this afternoon and in the debate yesterday, but it obviously needs to be said time and time again, because so far the measures haven't been taken that are needed. Statutory sick pay is not enough to be able to support yourself and your family. The level of statutory sick pay is insufficient. The eligibility is also a huge problem. If you are self-employed or you earn below the lower earnings limit, you are not able to get statutory sick pay. So some of the people who most need it are denied the support that the government say that is necessary. There are other people who are not sick but also need support. If you are self-isolated, you might not have symptoms, you may not be sick. But the right thing to do is to stay at home. And if we want people to stay at home, they need support. Similarly, carers, and we're going to have a statement from the Secretary of State for Education later this afternoon. If, as it now seems inevitable, many parents are going to have to take time off work to look after their children, they are not sick, Madam Deputy Speaker, but they need support to do the right thing. But of course, there are also many, many people who are facing redundancy, whose businesses cannot employ them anymore, or if they are self-employed, there's just not the work coming in. And those people at the moment are not able to claim statutory sick pay, and they will have to wait in the queue for universal credit or ESA if they have those contributions. Well, I say to the Minister, that is not supporting to people to do the right thing. And so we'll come on to the point, but first of all, I will take an intervention from the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm very grateful. Does she also agree with me that there are workers who've had their shifts cancelled, who've been told that their hours are reduced, many of them on 0-hour contracts, and they too also need that support that she's quite rightly saying should be given to workers?
Yeah, absolutely.
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. And for many people, if they see a temporary reduction in their work, they can draw on their savings. But for many, many others, and many people, certainly who I represent, and I know the Honourable Gentleman's constituents as well, do not have the savings to draw on. Absolutely. The Resolution Foundation published evidence last week ahead of the budget to try and influence the budget that showed that people on low and middle incomes, 60% of them have less than £100 of savings. Yep. They don't have the resources to draw on, even for a temporary period of time, to pay the rent, to pay the mortgage, to pay the bills and put food on the table. And so we must offer more support. And that is what other countries are doing, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Norway, full pay for those laid off for 20 days. The self-employed get 80% of their average income over the last 3 years. In Sweden, laid-off workers guaranteed 90% of their income. The government will pick up half of that, and employers are expected to pick up the other half. In Denmark, the Danish state will pay 75% of the salaries of laid-off workers. And that's the same in many other countries as well. If it's good enough in Denmark and Sweden and in Norway and in other countries around the European Union and elsewhere, then frankly it is good enough for workers in this country as well. And with some urgency now, Madam Deputy Speaker, this government have got to come back to this House and tell us that support is not just available for business, although that is very welcome, but that support is available to workers as well. Because unless that happens, then people are not going to be able to self-isolate and stop this virus from spreading, but also this health crisis is going to become an economic crisis where many, many people are paying the price for this virus, and it didn't need to be this way. So let us look at income replacement and let's get there quickly to ensure that the help is available. But Madam Deputy Speaker, this isn't just about helping people now, as important as that is. If we put in place income replacement so that people are not laid off or made redundant, then we're also supporting the economic recovery. Because this crisis, this pandemic will pass. And we must believe that, and we know it is the case. But when this pandemic does pass, and people want to go out again, and people want to start spending in shops and in restaurants and bars and theatres and cafes and travel on aeroplanes, then we need to ensure that the economic fabric of our country is still intact. And the best way to do that is to ensure that workers remain attached to the firms who have been employing them. And so income replacement can help people now, but it can also ensure that our economy can get back on a sound footing when this crisis has passed. And so to build the economy we need to see after this, again I would urge the government to urgently introduce a system of income replacement to help the economy recover. The issue of renters has also been mentioned this afternoon by the front bench and by other honourable and right honourable members. There was support yesterday for people with mortgages, and again, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is very welcome. But many people, particularly those in precarious work and those on low pay, do not have mortgages. They are privately renting, or they're renting in the social sector. In my constituency of Leeds West, less than a third of homes are owner-occupied. The others are either in the private rented sector or in the social rented sector. And we need to do much more to support those people as well, because if they are on statutory sick pay now, or if they've seen a fall in their income, or if they are expecting to be made redundant, then frankly they're not going to be able to pay their rent in the days and the weeks ahead. Right. And so it was welcome that the Prime Minister said there will be support for renters. We need to see the detail of that, and we need to see that support coming directly to landlords and renters to ensure that nobody is penalised because they don't have the money to pay their rents right now. And that means support for local authorities who are big letting agents, big providers of social housing. The money needs to go to the housing, the support needs to go to the housing associations and also large landlords. And we should be working with local government to ensure that we are reaching and talking to the biggest letting agencies and estate agents to ensure that that support is getting getting to people on the ground. But again, I just can't say how important it is that this action is needed urgently. The representative of the hospitality sector said last night that we are staring into hundreds of thousands of redundancies in that sector alone. So income replacement and support for people in the rented sector is crucially important. And the support for mortgages is a 3-month holiday. And again, I'll just say, I'm not sure that that is the right approach in the private rented sector, because a 3-month holiday on your mortgage, and you could then add that to your mortgage debt, is one thing. But if in 3 or 4 months' time you've got 4 months' worth of rent to pay, that is not going to be much good to people who may not have found their incomes have recovered by then. So we need to be sensitive about ensuring that the support is there for the period of time that it is needed for. Finally, I just want to say something about gas and electricity and broadband and television licences. These are all essential services for people, and they're going to be more essential in the weeks and the days and the months ahead as more people are having to stay at home. And broadband is now absolutely an essential service, because the only way that many people can get food delivered is by ordering online. And so, again, I would urge ministers to say to the providers of those essential services that nobody should be cut off from those essential services as long as this pandemic lasts, because otherwise people are going to find themselves without the very basic infrastructure to be able to stay in their homes. All of this global pandemic has thrown into sharp relief some of the problems in our labour market and in our social security system. And so when this is all over, we cannot go back to business as usual.
Absolutely.
If you can't survive on £94.25 on statutory sick pay when there is a global pandemic, then, Madam Deputy Speaker, you can't survive on £94.25 at any other time. And so we need to look at the waiting time for universal credit, the level of statutory sick pay, who is eligible for it, and also, frankly, how our labour market works. We have 1 million people on 0-hour contracts. We have almost 5 million people who are self-employed. Some choose to be, but many have no choice. And so we do need to look at how our economy works and who it works for. Because whether you're in the midst of a global pandemic or not, there are too many people in our country who our economy, our labour market and, frankly, our society doesn't work for.
Wes Streeting.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend, the member for Leeds West, and my right honourable friend, the member for East Ham, the chair of the Select Committee. And I want to build on some of the points they were making, both about the practical challenges that people face in the midst of this pandemic, but also some of the fundamental questions it should pose to each of us as members of a society that have left far too many people far too dangerously exposed, not just in the face of this pandemic, but to everyday life, the plight that has gone unanswered for far too long. And I want to begin, Madam Deputy Speaker, also by paying tribute to particularly those workers in the NHS who are putting themselves, frankly, in harm's way as they treat people in the midst of this pandemic. And I absolutely echo what my honourable friend for Leeds West said. It's crucial that NHS workers have access to the right kit to do the job. Absolutely. And that where there is any concern about the diagnosis of those NHS workers or their family members, that they are considered priority cases for testing. Frankly, the government's claim to be amongst the best in the world at testing only tells us that the rest of the world has much more to do, because we are hearing far too many cases of people who do need to be tested not receiving that test. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, the crisis we face isn't just a public health crisis, it threatens to be an economic one. The supply and demand side shocks that it will pose will be both simultaneous and severe, and that requires coordinated action on the part of government and industry on a scale that, frankly, we haven't seen since the Second World War. It is going to require a wartime mobilisation for this peacetime crisis. And for many families, this afternoon and this evening, as they gather around the kitchen table to consider what a loss of earnings or perhaps loss of employment would mean for them and their families, they are staring at the hard reality of a social insecurity system that has left far too many people grappling with poverty and insecurity and an ongoing crises as a result for far too long. No one can or should be expected to live on statutory sick pay of £94.25 a week. No one should be expected to live on universal credit, which in some cases can be even less generous, if that's the word, than statutory sick pay. And so I echo the calls we'll hear this afternoon for increases to statutory sick pay and universal credit to ensure that our social security system provides just that, social security, not just in the worst of times, but in the best of times for our country too. And I think ministers should ask, but frankly, so should people in our communities, how it was that the political choices of successive governments and, frankly, the political demands of sections of the electorate ever allowed a position in which we allow people who've fallen on hard times to fall into harder times further still because of the social insecurity system that pushes people further into poverty, further into mental ill health, and further into family crises, which make it harder, not easier, to escape from. I suspect, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm one of a minority of people in this House who knows what it is like to grow up in a household that is reliant on the social security system, to know what it's like when there is more days left at the end of the month than there is money. What it is like when people have to beg, borrow and steal to put food in the fridge. What it is like when the electricity meter has run out and so has the emergency. And what it is like to feel a victim of the state rather than supported by the state. So we should resolve, in the midst of this crisis, that once this is over, never again are we going to allow our social security system to fail people in the way that it did before this crisis and which it threatens to do within this crisis. Yesterday, the Chancellor set out a whole series of measures to help businesses and to try and get the economy through this, and I welcome those measures. But we've got to learn from past mistakes. It is not enough to bail out businesses, which is important. We also have to bail out people. And as we build the economic recovery, we have to ensure that the quantitative easing that helps provide liquidity to our economy to help things going as best as they can in difficult times is also a quantitative easing for the people too. So by all means, let's call for an increase in statutory sick pay. Let's call for an increase in universal credit. Let's call for an increase in disability benefits to make sure that people can live with dignity and a good quality of life if they are unable to work. All of those things are important. But instead of quibbling around with piecemeal measures here, a bit of mortgage relief here and a bit of rental support there, why don't we just provide every household in this country with the security to know that the government will provide protection for people's incomes so that they can continue to make sensible choices for their families, so that they know that when the end of the month comes and the mortgage is due, that they can pay it, so that they know when the rent is due, that they can pay it, so that they know that when the bills are due, they will be able to pay them, so that when they have to go and do their shop, that they will be able to pay for it. I have always been a sceptic of the principle of universal basic income because I fundamentally believe in an economy and a social security system that redistributes wealth from those who have it to those who need it most. And I'm also cynical, Madam Deputy Speaker, because while there are many principled and decent-minded champions of universal basic income on the left of politics, the left should regard the principle with suspicion when some of its leading champions have been right-wing economists, like the father of free market economics, Adam Smith. There is a right-wing vision of universal basic income which is about dismantling the state and which says, well, if we provide everyone with the income, we don't need to provide the services centrally because people can pay for it. It's one of the reasons, I suspect, why the Trump administration hasn't needed much persuasion to provide a form of basic income. But while we should regard the principle with suspicion as an ongoing solution to how we provide social security for people. I think there is now a strong case for a form of basic income to see us through this crisis. It could be a universal payment made available to everyone, where the tax system is used to recoup money from those who genuinely don't need it. It could be a form of basic income where those who need it simply apply for it and then receive it. It could be a form of income protection, like those described by my honourable friend, the member for Leeds West, which is already working well in Scandinavia. But one way or another, we have to make sure that families have incomes to see themselves through this crisis, because, as we have already heard, the majority of people in this country tonight are one payday away, or lack of payday away, from being in a real crisis. And the crisis for them will be a crisis for all of us if demand is further sucked out of the economy. So I hope that that's a message that ministers will take back to the Treasury. The final thing I want to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, is it's not just the social insecurity system that's left people exposed in this crisis. We've got to make sure that this is a turning point. It could be that our political choices further entrench inequality in our society, frankly, as the coalition and Conservative governments did after the last financial crisis, where too many of the political decisions and too many of the so-called tough choices to balance the books were balanced on the backs of the poorest. I'll give way.
The honourable member's making a very good speech, and I agree with much of what he, if not all of what he has had to say. And he's making a very important point, coming to a very important point about what happens after all of this. There's been a massive fiscal stimulus over the last week, and we expect more to come. What I think all of us would expect is for us not to get into a position where we have austerity Mark II in order to see us out the other side of this.
I wholeheartedly agree with this point, and let me conclude now, Madam Deputy Speaker, by making this point. In the aftermath of the last financial crisis, the Labour government, and in fact the reputation of the Labour Party, was utterly trashed because Gordon Brown's government took the courageous steps that were needed to prevent a financial crisis in America, which became a global financial crisis, becoming a depression where people wouldn't be able to take money out of the banks. The government was right then not to be squeamish about borrowing, to make sure that our country got through it, and this government shouldn't be squeamish now. I suspect that by the end of this, the government will own a larger stake of the British economy that will make Labour's last manifesto look positively conservative by comparison in its ambitions. And if that's what it takes to see us through this crisis, that is what the government will have to do. We are going to need a wartime response to get us through this crisis, so let us think now about the peace that will follow. And just as our generation looks back on that 1945 Attlee government with pride at the decisions they took and the legacy they left, let's think now about the legacy that we will leave for our country. Let's make the choices now that lessen inequality in our country and provide genuine social security in the best of times, not just the worst of times. Let's ask how it was that political choices left our social care system at breaking point and the people languishing in it more exposed to this pandemic than they would otherwise have been. And let's repair our broken social care system by making brave political choices. Let's care more about how we fund the living to lead a good life than about how we tax the dead. Let's make sure that when people look to old age, they're not just looking back on a life well lived, but able to live life to the full until the very end. Let's see this as a wake-up call, that if a pandemic can seriously disrupt the labour market and we have to provide serious income protection to see it through, then let's think about what a technological revolution will do as it displaces, relocates and significantly changes the shape of the labour market. And let's make sure we have the social protections needed now to face the next revolution, not just the current crisis. And let's not let this global pandemic distract us from the urgency of the climate emergency. And let's make sure that our recovery from this is a green recovery. And finally, Let's not listen any longer to the siren calls of the populists and the nativists who believe that countries can go it alone and that we have to build a world where we're all in it for ourselves, and recognise that global problems require global solutions and global leaderships through global institutions. And just as the Attlee government rebuilt the fabric of the country through a new welfare state and built international institutions, let us resolve to do the same again.
Bill Esterson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard some very powerful speeches from members from three parties, and I commend my honourable and right honourable friends for what they have said. And following my honourable friend from Ilford North is quite a challenge, because I think he spoke so powerfully, starting with his own personal experience growing up in the grip of the completely inadequate welfare system we had then. I think the point he made, which really touched me, was just how dangerous it will be if we do not respond to this crisis by putting in place the economic measures that are needed right now, because we run the risk of subjecting millions of our fellow citizens to a very long-term situation of hardship. That is why this is so urgent and needs so much action from government, and as my friend from Leeds West said, only the government can take that action. We face a situation in this country where the figures that I looked at yesterday for the number of fatalities, where we'd got to 69, that had doubled at that stage in 2 days. If that is the rate of growth of the number of fatalities, we will be where Italy is today by next Friday. That is the reality of what is happening if those figures are right. And it brings home to me, and I'm sure to everybody, the need for the fastest possible action on health and also on the economy. And my honourable friend from Ilford North mentioned the need to support health workers, and that applies right across the public service. Number one priority, getting them the protection so they can do their jobs, and making sure that the testing regime is there as quickly as possible. It will not wait any longer. But that is only very closely followed by the economic response that is needed as well. Because if we are to give the reassurance to people across our country to take the action that is recommended by the government, rightly the correct recommendations which the Minister spelled out, then we have to give them the financial assurance that they can take those actions. And it has to happen straight away. The SNP spokesman said in the next few hours, I think, as part of his remarks. He's absolutely right about that. So the measures yesterday are only a start. The Chancellor, I acknowledged they were only one of a number of steps. He's right to say that. But today, as a result of this debate, ministers are hearing further reinforcement of why it is so important that we get the action for individuals today. Not next week, but today. So I will give some case studies. A bus driver in London who believes they have the symptoms of coronavirus, still going to work because sick pay wouldn't be enough money to put food on the table, let alone cover the £1,200 in rent that he pays every week. He can't afford not to work. The reflexologist who works in a care home and is now not able to go to work because she is a visitor. The dog kennel owner is not going to get any dogs to look after. Their income's gone. The tutor who will has lost all of her income. My honourable friend from Leeds West talked about renters. They're often also the most at risk from income loss because of the nature of the work that they're involved in. And can I say that the government needs to support landlords as well as tenants in the private rented sector, as well as supporting social housing landlords at the same time. We've heard reports about rough sleepers being on the tube in London and on public transport elsewhere, who are clearly in great distress. the support for people who are outside the system is essential straight away. And at this stage, as far as I can see, it's not in place.
Will the honourable gentleman give way?
Absolutely.
I wonder if the honourable gentleman agrees with me that for lots of the people he's talking about, that yesterday the Chancellor repeatedly said that the measures with regard to universal credit for those who are self-employed, for example, instead of being able to get SSP in this circumstance, is simply not good enough. And today I've had lots of reports of people trying to do that in my constituency, and they are being told by the Department for Work and Pensions that they have to go to a face-to-face meeting, that they have to go through a series of protocols in order to do this, let alone the face-to-face meeting dangers of it. It's simply not the case that these people can get any access to universal credit at the moment.
Well, I thank her for what she said. It reinforces the point. She made the same point in the question she asked the Chancellor yesterday evening. And I just hope ministers are taking on board how quickly this needs to change. One of my constituents made the point who is self-employed, and there is a real problem for 5 million people who are self-employed, who've lost all of their work, that they don't qualify for statutory sick pay, whether it's universal credit or ESA. It simply isn't anywhere near enough money. He's staying at home observing advice from government, not able to earn his weekly wage, and whatever package from the government that the Minister already referred to, it's nowhere near enough for what they need. Another of my constituents, a nurse, who asked me to raise the situation of principal carers who live with somebody in a vulnerable group. What is the advice and response to her? And the example she gives is her son, who cares for his wife. She has a chronic respiratory disease. She's 26, but with that disease, she's clearly in one of the highest risk groups. Now, she can't work and doesn't leave the house, but what's he supposed to do? He's still going to work with great anxiety because he might catch the disease and pass it on to her. They have a mortgage, they need his income. These are the cases, these are the real-world examples. We've all heard them from our constituents and from others around the country, and they show why the action has to be immediate. And I mentioned the self-employed and freelancers, small firms as well, people on 0 hours contracts. The support just isn't there. 94.25 a week if you're employed and qualify isn't enough. Universal credit isn't enough. There's support announced yesterday for the hospitality and retail sectors for a few weeks is encouraging, but actually what's really needed is the kind of cash injection that a number of my honourable and right honourable friends have already mentioned and that was put to the Chancellor last night in the questions. Loans are part of the answer, but loans from a banking system that many businesses still don't trust because of the way they behaved during the financial crisis. Exactly. There's a massive question mark there, and loans have to be repaid. Yeah. It was the point I made to the Chancellor in the question I asked last night. In reality, we have to avoid storing up problems further down the line in the actions that are taken now. These were very big numbers, eye-catching, headline-grabbing numbers, £330 billion. But the reality is the £10,000 on offer to small firms is not going to last very long as a grant. And then there's the question of information. Now, the Minister mentioned the gov.uk website. Not many businesses, I'm afraid, because I work with them across the country, are aware that that's where to go to get this kind of information. The government needs to do a lot more to get the information out there quickly on a range of these issues, using social media, using the television and radio as well. And the loan system, the grant system for businesses announced yesterday, it appears only to be starting next week. Again, this is so much later than it's really needed. Is there any way of bringing these things forwards? We've heard about the examples in Scandinavia, 75% contribution by the government in Denmark, 90% in Sweden, in Germany, it's 60%, 67% if you've got parental responsibilities. The Minister said these things take time. Why is it that these other countries have been able to put these measures in place so quickly and we're not at that stage yet? What is holding us back, yet they were able to do it? Because it seems to me if they can do it, so can we. So are they looking at what the TUC is saying about a real living wage? At what other members have said about a universal basic income for whatever time-limited period might be right? I tend to agree with my honourable friend from Ilford North on that point. Really, what's needed is a redefinition of what we mean by sick pay, isn't it? Because it's not just whether you're sick, it's whether you're at danger of becoming sick and infecting other people. It's giving that financial reassurance. It's making up for the lost jobs, the livelihoods that are at risk, the contracts that have gone in whatever sector of the economy, and for as long as it takes. If we don't get this right, and only the government can intervene, it will be so much worse for the health of us all, and it will be so much worse for the economy. So the watchword is that the government says they'll do what it takes, whatever it takes. I think that's the three-word slogan of the moment, isn't it? Well, whatever it takes means giving every single person in this country the financial security they need right now to make sure that they can protect themselves, their families, and the rest of us.
Richard Fuller.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to you and would like to apologise to the opposition spokesman who spoke first that I missed coming to the chamber the first part of her speech, but I did want to listen and make a contribution, so I appreciate the opportunity, and to thank the opposition for raising this debate, which covers really two of the things that are on most people's minds, which is reducing the likelihood that I will get sick, or anyone in my family will get sick, or anyone I work with will get sick, and if that does happen, that I'm protected, and then trying to protect me in work and my job over the next few weeks, and then my job as we recover. And I think the debate has raised up a number of issues, and I'm not going to pick at any of the ones that have been made, but want to make some observations around that. The first would be what a difference a week has made. It is 7 days since the budget that we had, and this is a very different circumstance. And I think we should give credit to all of the efforts in this House and on the government for the measures that the government has already taken to respond as quickly as it can on such a wide range of issues. None of us in this room have the power of the Almighty, and therefore we should understand that we work within human frailties. And I'll come back to the frailties of our systems we work with in a minute. The second, I'd like to add to some of the examples that were raised earlier on by the SNP spokesman, who I've forgotten, unfortunately, the constituency represent, Adrian Schultz, about the response that the public are making. And for myself this week, I've met with churches who are working on good neighbourhood schemes. I spoke today with a playwright in the village of Alsey who's putting together a group to bring skills together in the community to assist people. We are seeing the best of people, but as some honourable members have mentioned, we're also seeing the worst of people. In a free society, you can see the best, but you can frequently see the worst. Harley Street doctors reselling tests at a high price, which would not be available to others, is a disgraceful thing for anyone with a professional qualification to do. We've seen pictures of the hoarders going into shops so that elderly and vulnerable constituents of mine are not able, and I'm sure everyone else, are not able to access the foodstuffs and others they need. And we've highlighted also some of the reaction of the largest bosses and some of their companies. I think it was Richard... Yes, I will give way for a moment.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. On that point, I have been contacted by a constituent who's informed me that their employer is insisting that they cannot work from home because they say they're waiting for stronger guidance from the government. Can the government offer clear guidance right now to my constituent's employer and many others across the country that if people can be working from home, they must be working at home? Thank you.
I appreciate the honourable lady's intervention, Mr. Speaker. I'm not speaking for the government. I'm sure the Minister will seek to address that. But I have to say, it sounds to me like that your constituent's employer is just making an excuse, because the government has been absolutely clear that it is the right thing to do socially for everyone in this country to, if they have a concern, to be able to isolate themselves from others and to work from home. I mean, what more does that person need to understand what they should do? And hopefully that will get the message very clearly from the front bench. But to the point of leaders not doing the right thing, I think the experience of Virgin Airlines has been raised that the owner or partial owner of Virgin Airlines has suggested they should take 8 weeks of unpaid leave. And I decided, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to look and see how much would that cost. Well, 8 weeks at the £94 statutory sick pay would cost £754 per employee. There are 8,571 employees in Virgin Airlines. So if all of them took 8 weeks unpaid leave, that would be a cost of £6.4 million. Sir Richard Branson's net worth is $3.8 billion. If he's able to get 2% interest on that money for 8 weeks, he will earn the equivalent of £9.9 million. So I say, Sir Richard Branson, give up your interest on your wealth for 8 weeks and pay your employees yourself their unpaid leave. Big or small, in a small village, a leader of a church, or a leader of a large business, when it comes to looking at the protection of your workers, the time is now, and we will judge you all by your actions. And the same will be for the government's actions. And I say there, sorry, very logically, are we choosing the right policies? And we've heard a lot about that today. I would congratulate the government on the staging of the announcements. There's so much pressure. All MPs are under pressure. Loads of questions, small, micro ones and very large ones that cover many. But I think the staging of announcements is a good approach because we need it to bed into people each day. If we put everything into a single day announcement, I would worry that although we would feel we were communicating out, the government find that the understanding is not being received as clearly as it should.
Will you give way?
I shall.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I commend his speech thus far. And to some extent, I agree that for preparedness, for working through particular policies of intervention, that there has to be some preparation, and that does take time. But in terms of people's livelihoods, people are losing their jobs now. Businesses are making decisions about their future viability now. So would you encourage the government, like I have, for an announcement to be made about the financial impetus that can be made to protect individuals and jobs in hours and not days, so that this response could be adequate?
Yes, 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 and yes, which is the yeses for each of the businesses in the last 24 hours that I've spoken with in my constituency who asked precisely for that. We often think, you know, how can a business suddenly be short of money to pay its own workers within a short period of time? But the truth of the matter is, in some sectors, cash flow is of a nature that those issues do come up. And more importantly, I would say to my front bench, every single responsible private sector business right now, first and foremost, will be thinking, how can I protect cash flow for the long-term survival of my business? And one of the nearest, shortest-term costs that can be reduced is your employee cost. And so there is this sort of sense that there is a need, as the honourable member rightly says, of in hours rather than days. And I think if we're fair, the Chancellor was very aware of that in his statement yesterday. And to that point, can I just encourage honourable members on both sides, I think there's slightly more on the opposition side than perhaps on this side for certain reasons, to think more about using what is already in place. The systems that we have that connect what the government can do to those institutions and people who need it, rather than trying to broaden out into a big and different debate about should we have this or should we have not. There is, of course, a time for debating about universal income. There is time for us to think about ways in which we might look at a better overall system in the future. But right now, I think proposals, if I can say to my friends on the front bench, proposals that use the existing arteries of the financial system, arteries of the benefit system, arteries of the PAYE and tax system that can reach people are what we should be looking either to amplify payments that are already made or to reverse flows from being ones into the government to being back out to those who need it. Please do not, front bench, please do not get too distracted by items along the way. I do think we should also recognise that there will be in this period a test for the labour market structure in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom does have some, not quite unique, but quite nuanced features, particularly its reliance on flexible working, its reliance on self-employment, where the changes that governments have put in over the last 15 years to create what is a flexible market, and there are benefits for that, will also be tested in this period where there is this pause in the economy. And I would encourage the government, after we have gone through this particular crisis, to look and see what lessons have been learned from that. And also, it is a question about a test for us in terms of the enlightenment we have on our social insurance system. I was moved by some of the contributions by the Honourable Lady, I think is the member for Leeds West, the chair of the Business Select Committee, and the Honourable member for the constituency of London, whose name I've also got terrible memory. Yeah, the speakers would correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Speaker. It's absolutely right. This is an opportunity for us to look at those items and to reflect. We may have different perspectives on that. We will definitely have different politics on it. But the need for us to look at this and to learn lessons, I think only a fool would say that we should not do that. And this is no time for fools. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, if I could just in closing say, the core message I would say to the government is, I think that the staging of announcements is absolutely right so it can bed in with people. Use the existing systems that we have to get money into the hands of the people and the businesses who need it, and follow the advice on all sides of the House, which we would welcome you moving with the speed of the time from the announcement to the time that that is available in that bank manager's office in Arlesey or in Bolnhurst or anywhere else in the country, or in that person's pay packet, or in their bank account, or in their benefit slip that they get.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank actually the member for North East Bedfordshire, who has been uniquely brave to speak from the backbench on his side, and I think there was much that I think that we could all on our side agree with him about. The scale of the coronavirus crisis means we need to take action in many forms, and ensuring people have economic security is second only to our response in terms of safeguarding people's health. The point will come when we have mass isolation. I feel that point is probably coming very soon. And that'll be whether people are symptomatic or not. This unprecedented challenge needs an unprecedented response. And we must work together and bring forward the right response that safeguards people and brings future confidence, not just immediate well-being. A measure that will do just that is an emergency universal basic income, which will give everyone the basic financial support they need to provide the necessities of everyday life through this crisis. My honourable friend from Ilford North, who's just left, made some very good points. That in normal circumstances, this might be a debate where we have questions, where we explore different aspects, where we talk about particularly on our side of the House, about the benefits of universal basic income against universal basic services. I might suggest to the government actually that if we had universal basic services in areas such as childcare and social care, we'd be a much better place to weather this crisis than having just a single universal basic service, the National Health Service, which is taking the brunt of the crisis. But taking that aside and thinking about where we are and where we're about to enter in the phase of the coronavirus crisis, I think taking this step is necessary. We just need to think about how our economy has changed fundamentally since 2008, with the number of self-employed having risen over the past 15 years from 3.25 million people to more than 5 million people. These people can only properly be protected through universal basic income, as well as those who are going to lose their employment very sadly, either through redundancy, through temporary lack of work, through the businesses failing and closing because of the crisis. Let's think about the app-based driver, the 0 hours warehouse worker, the children's entertainer, the agency-supplied care worker, none of whom have an employer that the government can incentivise by keeping them in work. A universal basic income will be more holistic and more effective than subsidising company payroll, which seems to be the government's main tool at the moment in dealing with the crisis. Finally, I'd like to just for a moment look across the Atlantic to the United States of America. Normally on this side of the House, we don't look to the United States of America. But actually, just yesterday, the US Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, said that cash infusions could happen swiftly. We're looking at sending cheques to Americans immediately. Well, this sounds very much like a temporary universal basic income to me. Andrew Yang, the former Democratic contender for the president, said that there should be introduced well before this crisis a universal basic income of $1,000 a month. He is now speaking directly to the White House. Donald Trump himself said, I think we're going to have to do something that gets money to them as quickly as possible. This is the measure which will get money straight into people and give them that basic economic security. And what I would say to the front bench, if Yang and Trump can work together, surely so can Sunak and McDonnell. Thank you.
Matt Rudder.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to speak in today's important debate. I would like to start by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Leeds North West, and many other speakers, including the member for North West Bedfordshire, who spoke very eloquently about this issue, and indeed the member for Ilford North, who I think made some very thoughtful and far-sighted points. I would like to address not just the policy responses which we need, but the underlying scale of the problem. And we've heard today how as many as 5.5 million people are self-employed in this country. I want to describe my experience of that as a constituency MP, but also set it in the context of the wider crisis which we face. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we do face an unprecedented situation, and I fully acknowledge the action that the government has taken. Measures to reduce the spread of the outbreak are vital, and I'm pleased that the ministers have now announced robust measures this week, and that includes the measures they announced yesterday to support businesses. However, the point I would like to make in my short speech today is that I want that action to go much further and to be much more resolute because of the scale and need of people in work who work for themselves and indeed who are on low incomes or in the gig economy. I support the range of measures that my honourable friend, the member for Wirral West, outlined earlier, and I would like to draw the Minister's attention in particular to the approach taken in Scandinavia and by a number of other European governments. We have mention of the Irish government here today as well. The government now needs to rapidly develop a comprehensive approach, a safety net for all workers and indeed all renters who are uniquely vulnerable in the current crisis. And I'd like to highlight what this means to local people in Reading and Woodley, the area that I represent. Self-employed people are the absolute bedrock of our local economy on a whole range of, carrying out a whole range of activity, both in the knowledge economy, public services, other forms of service, retail, distribution. So to just start, I would like to highlight the role and the importance in our local economy of IT subcontractors. We have some of the largest IT businesses in the world based in our part of the Thames Valley. Those large businesses subcontract to many, many smaller businesses. Most of those are one-woman or one-man bands who are very dependent on a relatively unstable economic situation. We also, as a growing and rapidly expanding area close to London and the Midlands, have a large amount of construction taking place. We have many small builders and other tradespeople who are dependent on jobs and on work which is relatively short term. They may only see a few weeks ahead economically. We also have a vibrant transport sector with a large number of people employed in the aviation industry at Heathrow. We have many taxi drivers and many people who work on the railways, all part of a transport sector which looks set to be severely constrained because of the crisis. Indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker, we're also the main shopping town for the southern part of, for the Thames Valley and the related parts of the South Midlands. And we also have a very vibrant gig economy with a number of distribution centres and warehouses nearby. This group of people, at the same time, and many of them are also renters, so we have a double hit in our local economy. On the one hand, many people who are vulnerable because they have only one guaranteed month's income ahead going forward, whether they are professional people, people with trades, or people who have other skills. But we also have the same group of people, many of them young families, living in rented accommodation, which is very high cost, in an area which is similar in cost to outer London or the centre of a major city around Britain. And I would like to draw the Minister's attention to this local example, which I believe reflects many towns and cities across the country, where you have this collision and reinforcement happening between, on the one hand, people's incomes are insecure and who are vulnerable and who haven't yet had their situation addressed by the government's measures, however helpful those measures will be to larger businesses, and they are also renters in a high-cost local rental economy, where rental income can be as much as £1,000 for a month for a basic accommodation. So the issue now, Mr Deputy Speaker, is to take action and to take it urgently, and I would ask the Minister to reconsider the government's approach, focus on the needs of these groups of workers and renters, think about the world from their perspective, where their income is not guaranteed, it's very vulnerable, they are the bedrock of the local economy in so many parts of our country, and indeed for the country as a whole. They deserve our support and our respect, and to come up with a plan, a realistic and workable plan, using whatever policy measures are necessary to protect them and their family income and to ensure their safety and security. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister if he's seen the proposals from the Communication Workers Union yesterday, which called for Royal Mail to act effectively as a fourth emergency service at the current time. It is the only organisation in the country that puts workers on every single street, 6 days a week, and postal workers are trusted in every community. Whether it is delivering prescriptions, or food bank parcels, or checking on elderly people who might need support, particularly if care services cannot be provided to them. There is an important role Royal Mail could play if appropriate precautions are taken. Will he join me in paying tributes to the union, and does the Minister agree with me that this should be explored as a matter of urgency, and will he commit to speak to the Communication Workers Union and Royal Mail to discuss this? Thank you.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, for calling me to speak in this very important debate today. It's difficult to follow such powerful speeches and such great orators who've made their points so eloquently, so I will be brief, but I make no apology for reiterating the points we need the government to act on now. Statutory sick pay will now be available for eligible individuals diagnosed with COVID-19 or those who are unable to work because they are self-isolating in line with government advice. And it's right to commend the government for their actions of making SSP available on day 1 instead of day 4 for affected individuals. However, at this time of intense worry and strife, it's also right to highlight where the government must act to help those who need it. Mr Deputy Speaker, statutory sick pay is £94.25 a week. We've already heard this. The equivalent weekly payment on the national minimum wage is £307.88. How can the UK government justify forcing potentially millions of people to live on under a third of their usual weekly income? The Chancellor himself stumbled when asked if he could afford to live on that sum, and I would implore colleagues across the House to ask themselves the same question. Could they? The UK Government's COVID-19 advice on their gov.uk website on statutory sick pay is only a total of 13 lines, but universal credit is mentioned 3 times. This is important that the government seeks to ensure those who are not eligible for SSP or those who are self-employed are aware that they can claim for universal credit. Well, that's fine, but I and my colleagues have spoken numerous times in this place of the difficulties inherent within the universal credit system. In this instance, I wish to specifically raise the fact that application must be made online and that claimants wait a period of 5 weeks for their first payment. I want to ask the Minister what steps the government are taking to assist those who are not able to leave their homes but who are also unable to access the web, so they may apply for the benefit. Furthermore, what steps is the government taking to ensure new universal credit claimants who are self-isolating, some for periods of up to 16 weeks, do not have to wait 5 weeks for their first payment? Alternatively, will the government consider extending the period over which advance payments must be repaid? The UK government will refund SSP for small employers, those who employ under 250 people. This refund, however, will only cover up to 2 weeks SSP per eligible employee who has been off work because of COVID-19. How can the government reconcile this with its current advice that some employees will have to self-isolate for up to 16 weeks? With thousands of local and independent businesses already scared for their continued existence, can the government reconsider this policy and offer SSP refunds for the total period of time that employees are required to claim during this crisis? I do appreciate these are unknown and challenging times, but I urge the government to consider people who are falling through the SSP safety net and act quickly and compassionately now. Thank you.